Out on the unforgiving plains of the American West, where hope and hardship travel side by side, a story unfolded that would be seared into the memory of all who witnessed it. This isn't just a tale of cowboys and pioneers. It's a gut-wrenching saga of a man shattered by grief, a community tested to its limits, and a woman whose quiet desperation would force her into an impossible choice. What happens when a father's love turns to madness, and the most innocent of lives are sold to the highest bidder under the vast, unpitying sky? Stay with me. The year of our Lord, 1876. The air in the Oregon-bound wagon train, a lumbering beast of canvas and wood, was thick with the dust of the Nebraska plains and the even thicker stew of human hopes. At its head was Benjamin Kane, a man carved from the very rock and grit of the frontier. His shoulders were broad, his gait as steady and far-reaching as the horizon itself. He'd led this train of 50 wagons, a motley congregation of farmers, dreamers, and outcasts from the mud-choked streets of Independence, Missouri, with a resolve that bordered on holy righteousness. But the iron in Benjamin's soul had a soft core, and its name was Lenora. Lenora Kane was the sun to his unyielding earth, her laughter a rare and precious melody in the monotonous creak of wagon wheels and the lowing of oxen, could coax smiles from the most stone-faced travelers. Her belly was swollen with their first child. No children, the midwife, a stern German woman named Mrs. Schmidt, had declared with surprising certainty. Twins. The news had rippled through the camp like a prairie fire, a welcome sign of life and future in a land that so often dealt in death. Benjamin had treated her like spun glass throughout the arduous journey. He'd padded their wagon until it was a rolling fortress of comfort, traded a prime bull for a milking goat to ensure she had fresh milk, and his eyes, which missed nothing on the trail, rarely strayed from her for long. He was a leader, yes, but he was a husband first, a soon-to-be father whose heart was already bursting with a love he hadn't known he was capable of. Their personal Eden amidst the wilderness was a small, tight-knit community within the larger train. There was the blacksmith, a burly man from Ohio named Silas Blackwood, whose hammer rang from dawn till dusk, and his quiet, watchful wife, Martha. There was the young couple, the Millers barely out of their teens, who held hands and whispered secrets when they thought no one was looking. And then there was Sarah Mulligan. Sarah was a shadow in the vibrant tapestry of the wagon train. A widow from Boston, she had buried her husband and 3 small children, all taken by consumption within a single brutal winter. Her grief was a cloak she wore so tightly it had become her skin. She was barren, a fact she never spoke aloud, but it was known, whispered with a mixture of pity and a strange, almost superstitious fear by the other women. Her wagon was stark, her movements economical, her face a mask of quiet resignation. She helped where she was needed, tending to the sick with a gentle competence that was both appreciated and unsettling her touch, a constant reminder of all she had lost. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, often followed Lenora, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, not envy, not malice, but a profound and hollow ache. As August bled into September, the train crawled into the desolate beauty of Wyoming territory. The landscape grew harsher, the mountains clawing at the sky in the distance, a formidable barrier between them and their promised land. The nights grew colder, and the mood in the camp, once buoyed by shared purpose, began to fray at the edges. Supplies were dwindling, tempers were shortening, and the vast oppressive emptiness of the land began to seep into their souls. It was during a fierce, unseasonable thunderstorm that Lenora's labor began. The rain came down in silver sheets, turning the campsite into a quagmire of mud and misery. The wind howled like a vengeful spirit, threatening to rip the canvas from the wagons. Inside the Kane's wagon, lit by the frantic, dancing light of a single lantern, the drama of life and death unfolded. Benjamin was a wreck. The man who could face down a band of Cheyenne warriors without flinching, who could set a broken bone with a grimace and a swig of whiskey, was reduced to a pacing, sweating mess. He'd been banished by Mrs. Schmidt, who had taken command with the authority of a field marshal. "This is women's work, Mr. Kane," she had said, her voice brooking no argument, as she shooed him out into the tempest. "You pray. That is your work now." He tried. He stood by the wagon wheel, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, and mumbled desperate prayers to a God who seemed very far away. The groans from within the wagon tore at him, each one a physical blow. He could hear Mrs. Schmidt's sharp commands, the softer, encouraging tones of Martha Blackwood, who had been called to assist. The hours stretched into an eternity marked only by the shifting shadows of the lantern and the escalating agony of his wife. The first cry, thin and reedy, cut through the storm's fury. A boy. Benjamin's heart leaped. He made a move toward the wagon, a sob of relief caught in his throat. But Mrs. Schmidt's head poked out her face grim in the lantern light. "Not yet," she barked. "There is another." He resumed his vigil, his anxiety now a sharp, serrated knife twisting in his gut. The rain lessened, but the screams from the wagon grew weaker, more desperate. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the cold dread that was seeping into his bones, a dread far colder than the rain. He heard frantic whispers, a sense of panic that hadn't been there before. Finally, after what felt like another lifetime, a second fainter cry joined the first. The girl, his twins, a son and a daughter. But there was no joy in the sound. It was followed by an eerie, unnerving silence from within the wagon. The cries of the infants were the only sounds now fragile and demanding. The flap of the wagon was pushed aside, and Silas Blackwood emerged, his face ashen. He didn't look at Benjamin. He simply put a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Jed," he began, his voice thick with a sorrow that defied words. But Benjamin pushed past him, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled into the wagon, his big frame filling the small space. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sacred scent of birth. Martha was weeping silently in a corner, her apron soaked with blood. Mrs. Schmidt was swaddling the two tiny red-faced infants, her movements brisk and mechanical, her face a mask of professional detachment that could not quite hide the tremor in her hands. And on the bed, lying so still, she could have been carved from marble, was Lenora. Her face, usually so full of life and color, was a pale, translucent white. Her eyes were closed, a faint, serene smile on her lips, as if she were listening to a beautiful secret. But the life, the light, the laughter, it was gone. A crimson stain was spreading across the sheets beneath her, a stark and brutal flower of death. Benjamin fell to his knees. The world, which had been so full of promise only hours before, tilted on its axis and shattered into a million pieces. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her cheek. It was already cooling. "No," he whispered. The word was a prayer, a command, a denial. "Lenora, wake up. Our babies are here. Our son, our daughter." But the only answer was the wailing of the two infants, their cries suddenly sounding like accusations. He looked at them. These two tiny creatures, swaddled in blankets, their faces wrinkled and new. They had taken her. They had stolen his son, his Lenora, and left him in a darkness so absolute, so profound. It felt like the end of the world. The love he had felt, the boundless, joyful love, curdled in his chest, turning into something cold and monstrous. The iron in his soul no longer tempered by her softness, hardened into something brittle and sharp. He looked at the twins, and in his grief-maddened mind, he saw not his children, but the price of his loss. And in that moment, a terrible, insane idea began to take root in the desolate landscape of his heart. The day Lenora was buried was unnaturally beautiful. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a piercing, indifferent blue. They laid her to rest on a small rise overlooking the Sweetwater River, a lone cedar tree standing sentinel over her grave. The entire wagon train gathered, their faces etched with a communal grief that was both for the woman they had lost and for the man who was losing himself before their very eyes. Benjamin stood apart from the others, a statue of cold fury. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had refused to look at, let alone hold, the two infants whose cries were a constant tormenting reminder of his loss. They were being cared for by a rotation of women passed from one set of willing arms to another. Martha Blackwood tried to hand him his son, swaddled and warm, but he recoiled as if from a hot iron. "Get it away from me," he'd rasped, his voice a raw, broken thing. The look in his eyes was not that of a grieving father, but of a man staring at the embodiment of his own personal hell. During the short, solemn burial service led by a farmer who read haltingly from a worn Bible, Benjamin's gaze was fixed on the simple wooden cross Silas had fashioned. He did not weep. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside him, a glacier of unshed sorrow. When the service was over and the others began to drift back towards the wagons, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear, he remained. He stood there until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple colors Lenora had loved. The beauty of it was a mockery. It was in this desolate twilight that the seed of his terrible idea planted in the blood-soaked wagon began to sprout its twisted leaves, unfurling in the darkness of his mind. He saw the faces of the families on his train, the Greers with their brood of 6 rowdy children, the Carsons who had just last week been celebrating their son's first steps. Families. Futures. Things he no longer had. Lenora was gone, and with her the man he was supposed to be. He was a leader of this train, responsible for their lives, yet he couldn't even stand the sight of his own children. He was a hollowed-out shell, a captain steering a ship he wished would sink. How could he lead them to Oregon? How could he raise 2 children on his own? 2 children he blamed for his wife's death. Every time they cried, he heard Lenora's last scream. Every time he glimpsed their tiny forms, he saw the life draining from her face. They were a millstone around his neck, dragging him down into an abyss of grief. He could not go on like this. He would not. A new kind of resolve, cold and sharp, settled over him. It was the logic of madness, the reasoning of a shattered heart. He could not abandon them on the prairie. That was a cruelty even his broken mind recoiled from. But he could not keep them. They needed a mother. They needed a family, and he needed to be free of them. He strode back into the camp. The fires were lit, casting a warm glow on the huddled groups of travelers. The murmur of conversation died as he approached the main campfire where Silas Blackwood was presiding over an informal council meeting. Every eye turned to him. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes burning with a feverish light that alarmed all who saw it. "There will be a change of plans," Benjamin announced, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was the voice he used to give orders in a crisis, flat and absolute. "We will rest here for one more day, to give the women time to prepare." Silas stood up, his brow furrowed with concern. "Prepare for what, Jed? We need to keep moving. The mountains can wait." Benjamin cut him off. He swept his gaze over the assembled faces. Men and women who had trusted him, followed him, looked to him as their guide. "Tomorrow at noon, I will be holding an auction." A confused silence fell over the camp. "An auction for what? Extra tools? A spare ox? I will be auctioning my assets." Benjamin continued the word, catching in his throat for a second. "The 2 children." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was as if he had struck each one of them physically. Women clutched their chests. Men stared in open-mouthed disbelief. This was not grief. This was sacrilege. It was an act against God and nature. Silas Blackwood took a step forward, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and anger. "Benjamin, have you lost your mind? You're talking about your own flesh and blood. Lenora's children. Lenora is gone." Benjamin roared, the sound ripping from his chest, raw and full of pain. For the first time, a crack appeared in his iron facade. "They are motherless. I cannot be a father to them. I will not have them grow up with a man who cannot look at them without seeing her grave. They deserve a family, a whole one. This is the only way." "This is madness," Martha Blackwood cried, stepping to her husband's side. "We will help you, Benjamin, all of us. We will raise them with you. They are the train's children now." "They are not the train's children," he snarled. "They are my burden, a burden I mean to set down." He looked around at the families, his gaze lingering on the ones with full wagons and healthy children. "You all want a future. You want a legacy. Well, I'm offering one. A son and a daughter. They will not be separated. They go as a pair. The highest bidder provides them a home. A real home. That is my final word." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving a stunned and horrified silence in his wake. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant, innocent cry of an infant from one of the wagons. In the shadows near her own solitary wagon, Sarah Mulligan had heard every word. Her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. While others saw madness, she saw something else. She saw a pain so vast it had inverted turning love into its horrifying opposite. She saw 2 children born of love being cast into the wilderness by a father drowning in sorrow. And in the barren, aching void of her own heart, a different kind of idea began to take root. It was not a terrible idea like Benjamin's. It was an impossible one. A desperate, foolish, and absolutely terrifying idea. But as she looked at her empty wagon, at her empty life, stretching out before her, like the endless prairie, it was the only idea that felt like it might, just might, be a reason to keep living. The night that followed Benjamin's decree was long and sleepless for the entire wagon train. A poison had seeped into the camp, chilling the air more than the high plains wind. Benjamin's madness, born of grief, had become a contagion. Whispers slithered from wagon to wagon. The initial shock and horror began to curdle into something more complex. There was condemnation, certainly. The Blackwoods. Martha, in particular, went from family to family, her face a mask of righteous fury, trying to rally a united front to stop the profane spectacle. "We cannot allow this," she insisted to anyone who would listen, her voice trembling with passion. "They are Lenora's babies. We have a duty." Many agreed, nodding grimly, but in the flickering firelight other conversations were taking place. The Greers, with their 6 children and worn-out wagon, saw 2 more mouths to feed as an impossibility. But the Carsons, whose only child was a toddler, exchanged long, speculative looks. Their farm in Missouri had failed. They were pinning all their hopes on a larger plot in Oregon. A son to help work the land in a few years, a daughter to help in the home. It was a tempting if ghoulish thought. The seed of opportunism planted by Benjamin's despair was finding fertile ground in the hardships of the trail. A man's soul might be damned for considering it, but a larger family was a form of wealth in this new world. While the camp wrestled with its conscience, Sarah Mulligan was wrestling with her own grim reality. Her impossible idea from the night before had survived the cold light of dawn, and now stood before her demanding action. She had nothing. In the world's eyes, and especially in the eyes of these pragmatic pioneers, she was the poorest of them all. She had no husband, no children, no future to barter with. She lit a small lamp inside her stark, lonely wagon and took stock of her life's inventory. It was a pathetic collection. From a small, locked chest, she pulled out the few remaining relics of her Boston life. Her late husband, Robert's silver pocket watch. It had stopped working the day he died, and she'd never had the heart to fix it. A string of delicate pearls, a wedding gift cool and smooth against her calloused fingers. Her own wedding band, a simple gold ring that now felt loose on her thin finger. She had 2 strong oxen, a sturdy if sparely supplied wagon, and the clothes on her back. That was the sum of Sarah Mulligan. How could she bid against a man offering a herd of cattle or a stake in a future gold claim? As she sat there amidst her ghosts, Martha Blackwood appeared at the wagon flap. Her face softened with pity. "Sarah, dear, may I come in?" Sarah nodded, tucking the pearls away, as if caught in a shameful act. Martha sat on a crate, her kind eyes scanning the Spartan interior. "I saw you last night," she said gently. "When Benjamin made his announcement, I saw the look on your face." Sarah said nothing. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You cannot be thinking of participating in this circus," Martha pleaded. "It is an offense to buy a child like a sack of flour." A fire sparked in Sarah's stormy eyes, a fire Martha had never seen before. "And what is the alternative?" Sarah's voice was low, but it vibrated with a lifetime of pain. "To let them go to the Carsons, who will see the boy as just another field hand, or to some other family who will pat themselves on the back for their Christian charity, while secretly resenting the burden I've seen that kind of charity. Martha, it runs out." "We would all help," Martha insisted. "For how long?" Sarah shot back. "The memory of Lenora will fade. The trail will get harder. The children will become a chore, a reminder of a tragedy. I know what it is to be unwanted, to be a burden." Her voice broke on the last words. "Those children, they deserve to be wanted. Desperately." Martha's righteous anger faltered in the face of such raw, naked yearning. She saw the truth in Sarah's words, and it shamed her. "But what can you offer Sarah? Benjamin is not in his right mind. He's talking about a price." "I will offer what I have," Sarah said, her resolve hardening. everything I have." The sun was high and mercilessly bright at noon. A space had been cleared in the center of the circled wagons, creating a crude amphitheater. It felt like a stage for an execution. The travelers gathered a ring of silent, uneasy spectators. Benjamin Kane, his face gaunt and his eyes hollowed out, stepped onto a large crate. He looked like a grim prophet, preaching a sermon of despair. At his feet, sitting on a blanket, was Mrs. Schmidt. In her arms, she held the 2 infants wrapped in clean linen. They were sleeping oblivious to the monstrous transaction that was about to take place over their very lives. "I will not speak long," Benjamin began, his voice flat and dead. "You know why we are here. I am selling a future, a son and a daughter. They are healthy, they are strong, they will not be separated. The bidding will begin now. What am I offered for my children?" A sick silence hung in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. The sheer insanity of the moment held them all paralyzed. "Come now," Benjamin said, a sneer twisting his lips. "Are there no takers? No one wants a legacy." Finally, Mr. Carson. His face, slick with sweat, cleared his throat. I'll offer my prize bull and 20 acres of my claim in Oregon." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a substantial offer. A prize bull was a fortune on the trail. Benjamin nodded slowly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. A prize bull and 20 acres. A respectable start. Do I hear more? Before anyone else could speak, a new voice cut through the tension, smooth and accented. "I will offer $500 in gold coin." All heads turned. Leaning against his wagon, looking supremely untroubled, was a man named Jean-Luc Dubois. A professional gambler from New Orleans, he had joined the train in Independence, keeping mostly to himself. He was handsome, elegantly dressed, despite the trail's hardships, and his eyes held a calculating shrewdness that missed nothing. No one knew much about him, other than that he won more poker games than he lost, and that he was headed west for reasons he never shared. $500. The amount was staggering. It was more money than most families on the train would see in 5 years. The crowd gasped. Silas Blackwood shot Dubois a look of pure venom. What could a single man, a gambler, possibly want with 2 infants? The unspoken answers were dark and unsettling. Benjamin's eyes lit up with a feverish gleam. $500. It was freedom. It was a clean break. He could take the money, leave the train, and disappear. He could outrun his memories. $500 in gold. He repeated, his voice tasting the words. A powerful bid, Mr. Dubois. It was then that Sarah Mulligan stepped forward. She moved from the outer edge of the crowd into the center of the ring, a small, determined figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. She looked directly at Benjamin, her gaze unwavering. "I cannot offer gold," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the stillness. "I have no land to promise." She began to unburden herself. She walked to her oxen, patting the flank of one of the great beasts. "I offer these 2 animals," she declared. She pointed to her wagon. "I offer my wagon and all its contents, my food, my tools, my blankets." She then walked into the center of the ring, stopping before Benjamin. She held out her hand upon which lay Robert's silver watch and the string of pearls. "I offer these, all the sentiment and memory I have left from my past. With a visible effort, she twisted the simple gold band from her finger. And I offer my wedding ring. She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Benjamin's. Finally, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, I offer myself. I will serve this wagon train. I will cook, I will clean, I will mend, and I will nurse the sick. I will be an indentured servant to you all until we reach the Willamette Valley, and our journey is done. I offer my past, my present, and my future. I offer everything I am and everything I have for the chance to be their mother. The camp was utterly silent. Not even the wind dared to move. Sarah's bid and offering of total, desperate, selfless love hung in the air, a stark contrast to the cold, hard glint of Dubois's gold. Benjamin stared at her, his composure finally cracking. He saw not the barren widow, but a woman offering a sacrifice so complete it bordered on holy. It was the kind of love Lenora would have understood. For the first time since her death, a flicker of something other than grief and rage moved in his eyes. It was confusion. It was doubt. Dubois pushed himself off his wagon, a smirk playing on his lips. A touching speech, madam, truly. But sentiment doesn't fill a belly or buy a passage. My offer stands. $500. Cash. Benjamin was trapped. On one side was a mountain of gold, offering him the escape he craved. On the other was a woman offering a sacrifice that spoke to the last flickering ember of the man he used to be. The entire wagon train held its breath, waiting for their leader to choose between damnation and a redemption he didn't believe he deserved. The world seemed to shrink to the small, dusty circle of trampled earth. Benjamin stood on his crate, a king presiding over a kingdom of ruin. His gaze flickered between the cold, hard promise of Dubois' gold and Sarah Mulligan's face, which held a universe of desperate, selfless love. He saw Lenora in that look. He saw the woman who had followed him into the wilderness, not for land or riches, but for the simple, unshakable belief in a future they would build together. A future he had just tried to sell for $500. The sneer on Dubois's face, the transactional coldness in his eyes, suddenly filled Benjamin with a profound and visceral disgust. This wasn't freedom he was being offered. It was a deeper kind of damnation. To hand his children, Lenora's children, over to a man like that would be the final betrayal, a desecration of her memory, far worse than his grief-fueled madness. With a shuddering breath that seemed to pull him back from a precipice, Benjamin looked down from his perch. His eyes fell upon the two sleeping infants in Mrs. Schmidt's arms. For the first time, he truly looked at them. He saw the curve of his own jaw on the boy, the faint dusting of reddish hair on the girl that was so like Lenora's. They weren't a burden. They weren't a price. They were his children. A wave of shame so powerful it nearly buckled his knees, washed over him. The auction, Benjamin said, his voice cracking thick with a self-loathing that was agonizing to witness, is over. He stepped down from the crate, his movements stiff as if his body was relearning how to obey him. He walked past Dubois, without a glance, his focus entirely on Sarah. He stopped in front of her, his gaze falling to the pathetic, precious pile of her life's treasures in her outstretched hand. He gently closed her fingers over them. "Keep your past, Mrs. Mulligan," he said, his voice low and ragged, "and your future." He turned to the stunned crowd. "The children," he announced, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority, "are no longer for sale. He then looked back at Sarah, and his next words sent a fresh shockwave through the camp. They are, however, in need of a mother, and I am in need of a wife. It was a proposal born not of love or even affection, but of raw, desperate necessity. It was a business transaction of a different sort, an arrangement of shattered pieces. Sarah stared at him, her sea-storm eyes wide with disbelief. Marriage? To this broken man who had just tried to sell his own children? Before she could process the thought to form a yes or a no. Silas Blackwood stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief and renewed anger. A wife, Jed, have you taken complete leave of your senses? You cannot solve one madness with another. The woman deserves better than to be your penance. It is not about what she deserves or what I deserve. Benjamin countered, his voice raw. It is about them. He gestured towards the infants. They need a mother's care. You know it. I know it. And Mrs. Mulligan, he looked at Sarah, a silent question in his eyes, has made her own desires in that matter clear. This is the only way to make it proper. To give them a name, a family. Jean-Luc Dubois let out a short, cynical laugh. How delightfully sentimental. And what of my offer? He asked, his voice laced with menace. I came here to do business. I find it rude to be denied. Benjamin turned to face the gambler, and for the first time in days the leader of the wagon train was present. His shoulders straightened, and his eyes, though haunted, held a glint of iron. Your business is not welcome here, Dubois. Take your gold and find another soul to buy. We have no more for sale. Dubois held Benjamin's gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills fought in the Wyoming sun. The gambler's smirk never wavered, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As you wish, chef, he said, the French word for leader, dripping with sarcasm. He turned and walked back to his wagon, leaving the community to grapple with the aftershock of Benjamin's shocking new decree. The decision was made. Sarah, in a daze, agreed. She didn't know if it was hope or desperation that guided her tongue, but the word yes escaped her lips, quiet but firm. That evening, as the sun set, the same farmer who had presided over Lenora's funeral now stood before Benjamin and Sarah. They were married beside the same river, not a stone's throw from the fresh grave of the woman Benjamin had loved. It was the strangest, saddest wedding anyone had ever witnessed. The bride wore the simple grey dress she wore every day. The groom's heart was buried on the hill behind them. Their vows were not promises of love, but a contract of survival. When the farmer declared them man and wife, Benjamin did not kiss his new bride. He simply nodded, then turned and walked over to Mrs. Schmidt, who had been watching with a stony, inscrutable expression. He hesitated for a moment, his hands trembling. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he reached down and, for the very first time, took his son into his arms. The baby, disturbed from his sleep, began to cry. Benjamin flinched, as if he'd been burned, but he did not pull away. He held the squirming, wailing infant against his chest, his face a mask of anguish and effort. He then looked at Sarah, who was watching him, her own heart aching with a mixture of pity and a terrifying, burgeoning hope. He needs his mother, Benjamin said, and he took a shaky step forward, offering the child to Sarah. As Sarah's arms, empty for so long, closed around the small, warm body of the boy, she looked not at her new husband, but at the tiny, perfect face now nestled against her shoulder. She then reached for the girl, taking her from Mrs. Schmidt. Cradling a child in each arm, A sense of rightness of coming home washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. The barren years, the lonely nights, the hollow ache in her soul, it all receded, replaced by the profound grounding weight of these two small lives. Her wagon and oxen were returned to her. Her wedding ring was slipped back on her finger. But she was no longer Sarah Mulligan, the Boston widow. She was Sarah Kane, wife to the wagon master, and mother to two children who had been sold and then saved in the space of a single, mad afternoon. As she settled the now quiet infants into a makeshift cradle in her wagon, she knew the real journey had just begun. She had won her children. Now she had to win a place in a broken man's heart and build a family from the ashes of a tragedy. And as the wagon train prepared to move on at dawn, with the shadow of Jean-Luc Dubois hanging over them like a carrion crow, she knew it would be the hardest thing she had ever done. The days that followed the wedding were a study in quiet desperation. The wagon train moved on, leaving the lonely grave behind, but Lenora's ghost rode with them. She was in the empty space in Benjamin's wagon, in the silence that stretched between him and his new wife. They were married, but they lived as strangers, bound only by the two small lives that now depended on them. Sarah moved her meager belongings into Benjamin's larger wagon, a space that still bore the imprint of the woman who came before her. It was an exercise in agony. She would find a stray ribbon, a pressed flower tucked into a book, a faint scent of lavender on a pillow, and each discovery was a fresh stab of guilt. She was an intruder, a usurper. Yet when she held the children whom she had named Caleb and Elora, the latter a gentle echo of the mother they would never know. All guilt dissolved, replaced by a fierce, lioness-like devotion. She was a natural mother. The hollow parts of her soul were filled by the rhythm of feeding, rocking, and cooing. Her hands, once idle, were now perpetually busy. The other women on the train, led by a contrite Martha Blackwood, rallied around her. They offered advice, extra milk, and moments of respite. They saw the depth of her love for the children, and respected it even as they watched the strange, cold marriage with pitying eyes. Benjamin, however, remained a man adrift. He threw himself into his work, becoming more demanding, more exacting than ever. He scouted further, worked later, and spoke only when necessary. He performed his duty as a leader, but the man within was gone. He slept under the wagon, leaving the bed that had been his and Lenora's to Sarah, a gesture that was both a kindness and a reinforcement of the chasm between them. He could not bring himself to hold the children. He would watch Sarah with them, his face a torment of conflicting emotions. He saw the beauty of the bond, the maternal grace he had dreamed of for Lenora. But to him, the babies were still tangled up in his grief. He saw them not as his son and daughter, but as Caleb and Elora, Sarah's children. His shame over the auction was a wall he could not seem to climb. To connect with them now felt like a hypocrisy he could not stomach. One evening, as Sarah was humming a lullaby to a fretful Elora, Benjamin approached the wagon. He carried a small, awkwardly carved wooden bird. He didn't look at Sarah, but at the tiny hand of his son Caleb curled in sleep. "I made this," he mumbled, his voice rough. "For the boy." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time he had offered anything a crack in the ice. "It's beautiful, Benjamin," she said softly. "He will love it when he's older." Benjamin just grunted, his gaze distant. Lenora. She was good with things like this. Whimsical. He turned and walked away before Sarah could respond, leaving the little bird a fragile token of a shattered heart on the wagon seat. Meanwhile, Jean-Luc Dubois was playing a different game. He had not challenged Benjamin again directly. Instead, he began to weave a web of influence. His gold, which had failed to buy the children, was now used for other purposes. When a family's axle broke, Dubois was there with coin to pay for Silas Blackwood's expert repair. When the miller's flour supply ran low, a sack discreetly appeared by their wagon, courtesy of the gambler. He never asked for anything in return, positioning himself as a benevolent, wealthy patron. He hosted poker games that went late into the night, plying men with fine whiskey he'd somehow kept preserved. In these games, he didn't just win money, he won confidence. He would listen to their complaints, Benjamin's harsh pace, the dwindling water, the fear of the mountains ahead. "A leader must have a clear head," Dubois would say, shuffling his cards with an expert flick of the wrist. "Grief, it is a cloud that can obscure a man's judgment. It is a tragedy what happened to Mr. Kane, a profound tragedy. One hopes the entire train does not pay the price for it." His words were poison delivered with a sympathetic smile. He was planting seeds of doubt, positioning Benjamin's grief not as a private sorrow, but as a public liability. The men, their judgment clouded by whiskey and the hardships of the trail, began to nod in agreement. The Carson family, who had bid on the children, became his most vocal allies. Silas Blackwood saw the danger. "He's a snake, Jed," he warned one evening. "He's turning them against you. He's making you look weak and himself look like their savior." "Let him play his games," Benjamin retorted. His pride stung. "My record as a leader speaks for itself." But the poison was working. The unity of the train was fracturing. They were becoming two camps, those loyal to Kane and those who saw a more comfortable, more prosperous path forward under the patronage of Dubois. The gambler's ultimate goal remained a mystery. He didn't seem to want to lead. He simply wanted to dismantle Benjamin's authority piece by piece. The twist came as they neared the South Pass, the gateway through the Rocky Mountains. A small scouting party, led by Benjamin, returned with grim news. An early freak snowstorm had made the pass treacherous. They would have to wait it out, perhaps, for a week or more in a sheltered valley. The news was met with groans and rising panic. A week's delay meant a dangerous drain on already low supplies. That night, Dubois called a public meeting. He stood before the main campfire, exuding confidence and control. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable, "we find ourselves in a difficult position. Our leader, burdened as he is, has brought us to a halt. But I have spoken to a man, a trapper I met on the trail some weeks back. For a price, he told me of another way, a lesser-known pass a few days' journey south. It is rougher, he said, but it is clear of snow." Benjamin stepped forward, his face dark with fury. "You spoke to a trapper and said nothing. That pass is untested. It could be a death trap. We stick to the known route." "The known route is blocked," Carson shouted from the crowd. "We'll starve waiting here." Dubois held up a hand for calm. "It is a risk," he admitted with a disarming smile. "But I am a gambling man, and I am willing to back my gamble. For any family that chooses to follow me on this southern route, I will personally guarantee their supplies until we reach Oregon. I will stake my entire fortune on our success." He had laid his trap perfectly. He offered a choice wait in the valley, with a grieving, uncompromising leader, or take a chance on a new path bankrolled by a man who seemed to have limitless resources. He was splitting the wagon train in two. Benjamin looked at the faces in the firelight, the doubt, the fear, the greed. He looked at Sarah, who stood by their wagon holding Elora, her face pale with dread. He saw his authority, the very foundation of his identity, crumbling before his eyes. Dubois hadn't just challenged his leadership. He had put a price on it, and Benjamin was horrified to see how many people were willing to consider the bid. The schism was a raw, gaping wound in the heart of the small community. Nearly half the Wagons, seduced by Dubois's promises and weary of Benjamin's grim leadership, chose to follow the gambler. The Carsons, their eyes alight with a feverish hope, were among the first to steer their oxen south. The Blackwoods, the young Miller couple, and a handful of others remained their loyalty to Benjamin, unwavering if deeply troubled. As the two parties prepared to separate, the air was thick with accusations and bitter farewells. That night, Sarah came to Benjamin as he stood staring into the fire. A man watching his world burn down for the second time. She carried Elora, whose small sleeping form was a stark contrast to the turmoil around them. "This is not just about a different path, Benjamin," she said, her voice quiet but insistent. "You are their leader. You have been since independence. But the man they followed then is not the man they see now. They are not just following him. They are running from you." Her words were not an accusation, but a simple, painful truth. He looked at her, at the strength in her storm-colored eyes, and for the first time he saw past his own grief to the damage it had inflicted on others. He had wrapped his sorrow around himself like a shroud, and in doing so had suffocated the very people who looked to him for air. The next morning, as Dubois's party readied to depart, Benjamin addressed the entire train. There was no anger in his voice, only a profound, weary sadness. He did not ask them to stay. Instead, he apologized. He spoke of his grief, of how it had blinded him, and how he had failed them as a leader. He looked at Mr. Quintana, Carson at the others, and his gaze was not of judgment, but of a shepherd losing his flock. "I cannot tell you the Southern Pass is a trap, because I do not know," he said, his honesty disarming. "But I know the man leading you. His promises are as empty as his heart. I pray you find your way. Godspeed." His humility stunned them all. It was not the reaction they expected from the iron-willed Benjamin Kane. As Dubois's wagons began to roll out, a sense of unease settled even on those who were leaving. It was then that Sarah gasped. Her eyes were fixed on the flank of one of Dubois's lead horses, a powerful bay that he himself rode. As the animal turned, the sun caught a distinctive brand on its hindquarters, a crudely shaped red hand. Sarah had seen it before. In Boston, the newspapers had been full of lurid tales of a vicious gang from the Western Territories who raided towns and trade routes. They were known for their brutality, for taking no prisoners, and for selling what and who they stole. They called themselves the Red Hand Brigade. The blood drained from her face. "Benjamin," she whispered, her voice trembling as she grabbed his arm. "The brand on his horse." The truth crashed down upon them with the force of a physical blow. Dubois was no gambler. He was a slaver. The auction had not been a whim. He had intended to buy the children from the start. When that failed, he orchestrated a new plan. He didn't want to lead the train. He wanted to divide it, to isolate a smaller, weaker group. The untested pass was an ambush. He was leading nearly half their people into a trap to be robbed, murdered, and sold. In that instant, Benjamin Kane was reborn. The grief did not vanish, but it was forged by a white-hot rage into a weapon. The hollow man was filled with a terrible, righteous purpose. He turned to Silas, his eyes blazing with the fire of a leader awakened. "Ride with me. We're going to get our people back." He strode to his wagon where Sarah was now clutching both children. He knelt, and for the first time he pulled both of them into his arms, burying his face in their blankets. "I have been a fool," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "and a poor husband." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness he did not deserve. "Keep them safe. I will be back for my family." "I know," she said, her own tears falling freely. "You are their father. Now go be their leader." Benjamin, Silas, and 5 other men rode out like vengeful spirits. They rode hard, their horses eating up the miles. They found the tracks leading not south, but into a winding, narrow box canyon. They were too late to prevent the trap, but not too late for the reckoning. As they crested a ridge, they saw the scene from hell below. The wagons were circled in chaos. The Red Hand Brigade, emerging from the rocks, had fallen upon them. The crack of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. It was a slaughter. With a roar that was pure, primal fury, Benjamin led the charge down the slope, his small band firing into the attackers' exposed flank. The ambushers, caught by surprise, were thrown into confusion. The betrayed pioneers, seeing their leader return, found new courage. Mr. Carson, his face a mask of horrified understanding, fought with the desperation of a damned man, falling only after he managed to pull the miller's young son out of the line of fire. The battle devolved into a brutal, swirling melee. Benjamin fought his way through the chaos, his eyes scanning for one man. He found him near the front of the canyon, trying to organize a retreat with the stolen goods. Dubois. Their final confrontation was not a duel of honor, but a savage brawl in the dust and blood. Benjamin, fueled by a purpose beyond his own survival, fought for every life Dubois had betrayed. He disarmed the gambler, his hands closing around the man's throat. For a moment he was tempted to end it, to crush the life from this monster. But as he looked into Dubois's terrified eyes, he saw that killing him would be an escape. He wanted him to live with what he had done. He knocked him unconscious and left him for the survivors to pass judgment on. The journey back was grim. The reunited wagon train was smaller, poorer, and scarred by loss. But the divisions were gone. They were one body, one people, forged in fire and blood. They looked at Benjamin Kane with a reverence they hadn't held before. They saw not a perfect leader, but a good man who had walked through hell and returned to save them. When he finally rode into the valley camp, Sarah was waiting. He dismounted his body, bruised his soul weary, and walked into his wagon. He knelt before the cradle where his children slept and simply watched them. The tears he had held back for so long, finally tracing paths through the grime on his face. They were tears for Lenora, for the man he had been, and for the father he now knew he had to become. That night, for the first time, he slept in the wagon bed with Sarah beside him. He reached out in the darkness and took her hand. Words were not needed. In the shared silence, a new foundation was laid, built not on whirlwind romance, but on shared loss, sacrifice, and a fierce, unyielding will to protect the family they had forged from tragedy. Months later, the Kane family stood on a hill overlooking the verdant expanse of the Willamette Valley. The journey was over. Benjamin stood tall, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. At their feet, young Caleb took a wobbly step, clutching the small wooden bird his father had carved, while Elora laughed from her mother's arms. The ghosts of the past were not gone, but they were at peace, woven into the fabric of a new life, a new beginning earned in the heart of the unforgiving West. And so the story of the Kane family comes to a close. It's a stark reminder that the journey west was more than just a quest for land. It was a profound test of the human spirit. In the crucible of the frontier heroes were not always the ones without flaws, but those who found the strength to face their own demons. Benjamin's path from a grief-shattered man to a true leader, and Sarah's journey from a barren widow to the matriarch of a new family, shows us that even in the deepest darkness, love and redemption can take root. What do you think? Could you forgive Benjamin for his actions? What would you have done in Sarah's place? This story is about the choices we make when all hope seems lost. If this journey into the heart of the Wild West moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from history's most dramatic chapters.